Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, colleagues and fellow students of history. My name is Ronald Graneri. I am the Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West, and I have the honor of welcoming you all to this FPRI History Institute and to introduce our first speaker. The Foreign Policy Research Institute is a think tank that takes as its motto, "A nation must think before it acts." Unlike organizations whose time horizons rarely extend back beyond the last presidential administration or forward past next week, FPRI cherishes the pursuit of knowledge as well as its intelligent application to policy analysis. We are committed to deepening understanding of the contemporary world through the study of history and culture, as well as the politics of the day, to help informed citizens appreciate the realities and mentalities of the localities. This weekend's program is the intersection of three ongoing activities at the FPRI: the Madeline and W. Keene Butcher History Institute, the Marvin Wachman Center for Civic and International Literacy, and the Center for the Study of America in the West. Together, these three endeavors reflect FPRI's commitment to developing new ways to connect with scholars and educators at all levels, as well as to help educate the general public. And we are very grateful both to the Butcher Family Foundation and to the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, who provide substantial financial support for all of these endeavors. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize and thank one of our co-sponsors, Carthage College, which, for a nominal fee, offers a graduate credit for this weekend experience, as with all of our other weekend experiences. You will find a flyer with information on that, the graduate credit question, in your folders. FPRI is also very proud to announce that this weekend event has been included in Global Philly 2013, a month-long series of events sponsored by members of the Global Philadelphia Association, and you will find a flyer including all of those events in your folders as well. So with all of that in mind, it's especially appropriate that we dedicate this weekend to the memory of Keene and Madeline Butcher. Keene was FPRI's longest-serving trustee, and both Keene and Madeline were among Philadelphia's greatest boosters. So it's fitting for us to have this weekend to discuss the significance of Philadelphia in the development of a polity that has had a very profound effect on the development of modern Western civilization. We're gathered here this weekend to consider the historical roots and the continuing significance of the creation of liberal democracy in America, a process whose formative events happened less than a mile from where we now sit. Inspired by Nicholas Pagan's 2011 FPRI essay, Philadelphia, One City's Maritime History and Its Impact on World History, which is also included in your folder, and we actually managed, because FPRI is a full-service foundation, we managed to produce the actual author of that essay, who is sitting in this room with us today. We will examine the curious alchemy of people and place. By discussing the events of the founding era, we will ponder what the past can tell us about the political, economic, and cultural prerequisites of liberal democracy, which will also enable us to explore the implications of what we know of the past for transitions to democracy around the world today. Linking historical knowledge to the geopolitical present motivates the FPRI and also leads us to bring together educators for a weekend of mutual discussion and exploration. Studying history means most of all grappling with two big questions: what and so what. It's important to know the facts, what happened, who was involved, the implications of, and the immediate impact of events. But true historical understanding extends beyond mere chronicle to seek deeper significance, to weigh interpretations and the relationship between cause and effect, and to attempt to draw from history insights that can inform our perspectives of the present. Analyzing the past can help us develop respect for the wisdom of our elders, of course, but also a clear understanding of and appreciation of their limitations. No amount of historical knowledge can save us from making our own mistakes, of course, but at least it should help us cultivate a healthy humility about our own limitations as well. Now, teachers have a special responsibility in communicating historical understanding to the public, building on their knowledge to develop the best strategies for introducing their knowledge to their students. Not only those students who are already experts or experts to be, but especially those who are seeking their first and often only exposure to a field. The uninitiated need to feel the enthusiasm of new knowledge in order to overcome their fears, and can only feel that if they meet a teacher who combines deep knowledge with genuine enthusiasm. Our goal with this institute is both to provide you all with new knowledge, but also to fire your enthusiasm to share it with your students and your community. We've brought together an all-star lineup of teacher scholars to help lay the foundation for the work that all of you will do in your own classrooms after you leave Philadelphia. And we hope you're looking forward to the explorations to come over the next 2 days as much as we are. Now it is time to begin our journey. All that said, it's a very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning. Dr. Walter A. McDougall is co-chair of FPRI's Madeline and W.W. Kean Butcher History Institute, chairman of FPRI's Board of Advisors, chair of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West, and, as fitting for a guy who holds all those chairs, he sits on the board of editors of FPRI's journal, Orbis. He is also the Alloy Anson Professor of International Relations and Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. His honors and awards include a Pulitzer Prize, election to the Society of American Historians, and appointment to the Library of Congress Council of Scholars. A veteran of Vietnam, a graduate of the University of Chicago. He has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as at Penn. His articles and columns have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Commentary, and other national publications. An unabashed generalist and an example to us all, his books range from France's Rhineland Diplomacy, 1914-1924, to The Heavens and the Earth, A Political History of the Space Age, to Let the Sea Make a Noise, A History of the North Pacific from Magellan to MacArthur, to the classic and soon-to-be updated work Promised Land, Crusader State, The American Encounter with the World Since 1776, and a 2-volume history of the United States from the founding through the Civil War era, Freedom Just Around the Corner, A New American History, and Throes of Democracy, the American Civil War era. A devotee of books, sports, politics, and all kinds of music from Bach to Bob Dylan, McDougall is also an award-winning teacher who has inspired thousands of students, readers, and colleagues with his erudition, his wit, and his passion for history. As befits his Scottish background, he would not want me to drift into sentimentality with this introduction, but I hope he won't mind my adding that it is an honor to call him a colleague and an even greater privilege to call him a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter McDougall.
Ron, thank you. You lie so eloquently, you should have been a diplomat. I am Walter McDougall. Good morning to you all and welcome. I am going to speak. I've been given a generous portion of time here, and I intend to use almost all of it, which makes me a very bad example for the subsequent speakers to come. But I promise you that I'll hang around the whole weekend, so if you do have any questions that you're not able to get in this session, have at me. Now, on July the 5th, 2013, the Philadelphia Inquirer described the previous day's celebrations under a headline in which Mayor Michael Nutter boasted, "Philadelphia owns the 4th of July." Wow. Well, this conference is an inquiry into that claim. In his 1997 A History of the American People, Paul Johnson wrote the following: "Amid this prosperous rural setting, it was natural for Philadelphia to become, in a very short time, the cultural capital of America. It can be argued, indeed, that Quaker Pennsylvania was the key state in American history and destined to be the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence." Well, in fact, the Keystone State isn't really a state. It's one of 4 commonwealths in the United States, along with Massachusetts, Virginia, and Kentucky. Nor does Pennsylvania's nickname date from the Revolutionary era, since that appellation was first used in 1803 by a Jeffersonian journal, Aurora, which called Pennsylvania the keystone in the Democratic Arch. Nevertheless, historians consider the image apt, because Pennsylvania occupied the key position among the colonies by virtue of its demography, geography, and economic, social, and political importance. It would seem obvious, therefore, to answer this conference's question with a resounding no. No. Philadelphia was no accident. Indeed, it was a sine qua non of the American Revolution. But historians must also always be aware of prolepsis, which is the fallacy of interpreting the past in terms of an implicitly inevitable future. In short, to read history backwards. William Penn and Benjamin Franklin are cases in point, because eminent historians herald their qualities, their tolerance, egalitarianism, industry, enlightenment, and capacity for self-reinvention as proto-American qualities. Indeed, you might say the five sides to our nation's keystone. For better or worse, rightly or wrongly, wrote historian Charles Sanford, Benjamin Franklin has been identified with the American national character. Though greater hero worship has been accorded to Washington and Lincoln, historians have almost unanimously judged Franklin to be the more representative. He is the inventor of the American character and way of life, unquote. For Thomas Carlyle, Franklin was the father of all Yankees. For Paul Elmer More, he was America's Renaissance man. Frederick Jackson Turner dubbed him the first great American. H.W. Brands, the first American, period. To Walter Isaacson, he was the multiple American. To Jonathan Lyons, the enlightened American. And to Gerardo del Guercio, the inventor of the American dream. All of that amounts to prolepsis, because it assumes the United States was already out there, on the horizon. In 1723, when Franklin left Boston for Philadelphia, indeed in 1682, when William Penn received his colonial charter. But in reality, William Penn was an English imperial patriot who had no notion of beginning the world over again. Likewise, Franklin was another imperial patriot until, at age 68, he suffered public humiliation at the hands of the British Privy Council. Even at that late date, the men who became our founding fathers had no idea that they would soon establish a new nation. Indeed, on October the 9th, 1774, just 6 months before fighting broke out on Lexington Green and Concord, George Washington wrote the following, quote, "I think I can announce it as a fact that it is not the wish or interest of the Massachusetts government or any other upon this continent, separately or collectively, to set up for independency. On the contrary, it is the ardent wish of the warmest advocates for liberty that peace and tranquility upon constitutional grounds may be restored and horrors of civil discord prevented," unquote. American independence was not an inevitability. It was an improvisation. To be sure, the colonists had made immense strides in their political theory in just the decade after 1765, when the Stamp Act initiated the conflict with the mother country. But independence seemed the least likely outcome, so much so that contemporary observers regarded the unfolding events with shock, dismay, and disbelief. When the last French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, ended in 1763 with a great Anglo-American victory, the colonists toasted the health of King George with gusto. Just a dozen years later, the same colonists damned his eyes and reached for their muskets. And for what? The ostensible causes seemed wholly inadequate to explain the scale of the unfolding tragedy. Joseph Galloway, the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, asked, "How then can it happen that a people so lately loyal should so suddenly become universally disloyal and firmly attached to Republican government, without any grievances or oppressions but those in anticipation?" Unquote. Galloway hoped that the discord had been exaggerated, out of proportion, and that reconciliation might still be effected. So far from taking the future for granted, historians are obliged to ask what might have happened had the British been more forthcoming or the colonists less hot-headed. Surely secession and civil war, which is what the American Revolution amounted to, needed more of a cause than a 3-penny tax on tea. Well, of course, the colonists argued it's the principle of the thing. Taxation without representation and the dangerous precedent of parliamentary supremacy. Those external causes, it's their fault, then became ostensible justifications because of the American decision to declare independence. Jefferson had to argue, out of a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, a little pretense there, that the cause of the rupture was British oppression, hence the long bill of particulars in his declaration. But implicit in that was a counterfactual, that the revolution would not have occurred if wiser policies had prevailed in London. That explanation, which began as expediency, soon hardened into orthodoxy, because American civil religion required that our nation's birth be providential, manifest destiny, and immaculate conception. So American historians interpreted their nation's founding in a way that affirmed the revolution, taught its values to the next generation, and implicitly recommended them to the whole human race. By such a process of historical alchemy, the exceptional became universal and the accidental became inevitable. You with me? However, a second set of counterfactuals, the ones asking what would have happened if the colonists had been less hot-headed, suggests that they were not just players in a heavenly drama, but protagonists who wrote their own script. To be sure, the conquest of Canada set the stage because it imposed new imperial responsibilities and costs on the British. Costs and responsibilities they expected the colonists to share, even as the defeat of the French freed the American colonies from dependence on British protection. Given the Quebecois and Native Americans were now also subjects of George III, and given that the Crown and Parliament did run up big wartime debts, they naturally looked to the prosperous 13 colonies to share the burden. Hence the Proclamation Line of 1763 to protect the Indians, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Currency Act, the Quebec Act that legalized the Catholic Church in Canada, the Tea Act, and the coercive acts that colonists deemed intolerable. The conquest of Canada was surely a necessary, though not a sufficient cause. The sufficient cause could only be a new self-awareness, what John Adams called the revolution in men's minds that had to precede the political acts of separation. And that occurred incrementally, if swiftly, when events caused Americans to inquire after the nature of the British Empire. What is this empire, constitutionally speaking? The colonies had all been created by private companies and or royal charters, wholly independent of Parliament. Even Quakers, loyalists, and accommodationists like Joseph Galloway and John Dickinson came to the First Continental Congress convinced that Parliament had no right to legislate for the colonies at all, whether or not it was taxation without representation. Consider the Galloway Plan of September 1774. The Pennsylvania delegate proposed an American legislature chosen by the colonial assemblies and an American president general appointed by the Crown to govern the colonies. Even the moderate First Continental Congress voted that down. They didn't want representation. In January 1775, Lord North proposed that Parliament simply request that colonial assemblies decide for themselves how to contribute to British administration and defense. Congress rejected that, too. Finally, Josiah Tucker, the Dean of Gloucester, suggested Parliament call the colonies bluff and force independence on the Americans in the expectation that they would come groveling back with an appeal to the crown. Of course, that proposal was never made, but it's true that Americans' anger was never targeted on the king until Tom Paine's Common Sense in 1776. Take away Tom Paine's Common Sense, and the historian can well imagine a self-governing American dominion under British sovereignty, like Canada, surviving to this day, if not for some internal reasons why Americans wanted independence. Finally, the military history of the War of Independence is replete with what-ifs, because the glorious cause might, some say ought to, have aborted on many occasions. What if the British had routed the Minutemen on Bunker Hill? Breed's Hill, really. What if Washington's army had been trapped on Long Island instead of slipping off to the mainland under the cover of fog? What if the British captain who'd got Washington in his sights during the Battle of Brandywine had pulled his trigger? What if Washington had decided against marching his army 500 miles in the slim hope of trapping Cornwallis at Yorktown? And so on and so on. Given all these contingencies, it would appear that the birth of the United States of America was a fluke. And yet the historical narrative also suggests that what made that glorious fluke possible was the location, culture, and people of Philadelphia. If Washington was the indispensable man, Philadelphia was the indispensable city that made the Declaration of Independence, victory in the Revolutionary War, and the triumph of the Constitution possible. At least that's what I hope to argue, beginning with some background on the unique colony founded on the Delaware River by Quakers. An historian recently prefaced his new biography with a lament. Quote, when I ask my students in the U.S. History Survey course, APUSH, who William Penn was, responses range from blank faces to the inevitable, oh, he's the guy in the Quaker Oats box. Sadly, in 24 years of teaching, I have watched Penn and the Quakers slip ever deeper into the recesses of historical memory, unquote. That's a shame, because Penn still casts a long shadow from his perch atop Philadelphia's City Hall. We shall be treated this weekend to a whole lecture on the Quakers and pluralism, so I'll confine my remarks just to the observation that William Penn made a huge impression on American history, as much because of his failures as his successes. Penn was the son of the famous Admiral William Penn, who, among other things, captured Jamaica for Cromwell's Commonwealth in the mid-17th century, but who kept up clandestine ties to the exiled Stuarts. And it paid off when Parliament restored Charles II to the throne in 1660. The king and his brother, James, the Duke of York, even promised the admiral on his deathbed that they would look out for his son. But the son, William Penn, improbably had become a Quaker, a pacifist, hostile to all authority, and egalitarian to the point of treason. Why, then, would King Charles grant Penn an exclusive charter to lands as extensive as England itself? Was it just, as some historians speculate, to pay off a large gambling debt that Charles owed to the admiral's estate? Was it just a ploy to lure the troublesome Quakers out of the country, get them to America? Did Penn, who was already experienced in the colonization of New Jersey, know how to slip his petition past the lords of trade without anyone really paying much attention? Well, the likely answers to these questions are no, no, and no. Because whatever personal motives might have been involved, the creation of Pennsylvania was premeditated statecraft. First, a strong colony on the Delaware, would swallow up the little Swedish and somewhat larger Dutch settlements already there. Dutch had been taken over by England in one of the Anglo-Dutch wars, and the Duke of York had presided over New York, but the Dutch had also founded settlements further to the south. And this new colony of Pennsylvania would strengthen the English grip on the commerce of the entire American seaboard. Secondly, putting a proprietor in charge freed the crown of financial responsibility. It was off the books. Third, naming Penn the proprietor ensured a friendly neighbor for New York, whose proprietor, as I say, was his friend or his patron, James, the Duke of York, and future James II. Penn solicited investments from wealthy Quaker merchants in exchange for choice parcels of land. One of them was Thomas Home. Home was the one who surveyed the rectangular grid of streets that would become the city of brotherly love. Imagined by Penn as a green country town, it was the first planned urban space in the New World. Philadelphia did not grow westward to Broad Street until the year 1830, but Holmes' prospectus, stretching all the way to the Schuylkill River, bespoke great ambition. 500,000 acres were sold the first year. Penn arrived in 1682 with no less than 18 large ships carrying abundant supplies and skilled colonists, the vanguard of 11,000 settlers in the first decade alone. Penn's agents in Wales, Ireland, France, and the Rhineland aggressively marketed the fertile soil and water, a Sylvania of timber, a holy experiment in religious tolerance, and not least, political liberty. William Penn was a disciple of Algernon Sidney, who believed that government should be free of coercion, ensure equal opportunity, and be blind to differences of birth, background, and faith. Oh my, but the reality of the frame of government contained in the colony's charter belied all that. It required that settlers give total obedience to the proprietor, who in turn owed total obedience to the crown. Algernon Sidney was appalled. "The Turk is not more absolute," he cried. What happened was that Penn was trapped. He didn't really set all this up on his own. He had to bow to the dictates of his friend James, the Duke of York, who simply insisted that, well, we're a new colony here, okay, we should have the same authoritarian arrangement that John Locke had recently drafted for the colony of Carolina. Well, not surprisingly, the Quakers themselves, Penn's settlers that he recruited, invoked Penn's own principles to rebel against the proprietor. They scoffed at quit rents and taxes. They smuggled at will. They accused Penn of abandoning his colony when he returned to England from 1684 to 1699, 15 years during which poor Penn did little other than fight lawsuits, but from his colonists and from neighboring colonies. In the meantime, of course, the Duke of York had become King James II, only to be dethroned in Parliament's glorious revolution of 1688 in favor of the safely Protestant heirs William and Mary. To make a long story short, Penn was obliged, with James II, to become a Catholic, and so Parliament threw him out in favor of the nearest Protestant relatives of the royal family. To make a long story short, Penn was obliged to grant his colonists a new Charter of Privileges in 1701, which empowered the elected assembly in Philadelphia to make its own laws and, in fact, to exercise more freedom than any other assembly in America, much to the frustration of poor James Logan, whom Penn left behind as his private secretary to try to manage the colony. Incidentally, the Great Seal of Philadelphia dates from this event. It's a shield with 4 quadrants depicting a handshake, a sheaf of grain, the scales of justice, and a merchant ship. By then, Philadelphia was already, 1701, America's second city, a hustling commercial port of 5,000 people who shipped flour, meat, and lumber to the West Indies while speculating on real estate here in Pennsylvania. People even submigrated from New York or Maryland because Pennsylvania always seemed a place where the grass was greener. But by then, Penn had in effect been mugged by his own colonists. And in his own age, he evidently reverted to a kind of deference for rank, wealth, and authority. And he died in 1718, having left a legacy elegantly described by former Penn professor Mary Maples Dunn. It is easy to conclude that he had come full circle, and that in the end, despite all the resistance, he became the man his father always wanted him to be. In short, we might conclude that class allegiance outweighed the hostility to authority generated in Penn's youth. But in terms of historical significance, this was not the measure of his success. He conceived and established a society without military defenses, with freedom of religion, and with a criminal code humane beyond anything known to Englishmen, with a written constitution containing guarantees of rights and checks on the power of the proprietor himself. Penn's greatness was greater than the sum of its parts, unquote. Sure enough, in Pennsylvania, freedom and equality were more on display than anywhere else in America, except perhaps quirky Rhode Island, too small to have much influence on others. But Pennsylvanians often refused to use their freedom and equality to advance Quaker principles, most notably pacifism. Once the colony had grown and demography altered the landscape, and French and Indian wars had become endemic. To be sure, the Quaker Party still clung to a slim majority in the Assembly during King George's War, the War of Austrian Succession, of 1739 to 48, and the Quaker Party still refused to contribute to military defense. But the valleys west of Philadelphia, that way, were filling up with Germans, Lutheran Germans, who were not pacifists like the Mennonites and the Amish, and in fact invented the Pennsylvania rifle, sometimes erroneously known as the Kentucky rifle. And the valleys were filling up with, the Allegheny Mountains were filling up with Scots-Irish, who far from being pacifist were downright belligerent. The city itself had a large admixture of Anglicans and Presbyterians, eager to battle French Catholics. And indeed, when a French sloop was sighted in Delaware Bay in 1747, the transplanted Bostonian, Benjamin Franklin, wrote a pamphlet called Plain Truth, which argued against pacifism on biblical as well as practical grounds. Philadelphians responded with a subscription and a lottery to finance a militia, and that symbolically ended the Quaker control. Soon, Presbyterians, such as Bucks County's William Tennant, were preaching sermons with such titles as, "The Lord is a Man of War." Oh, my. Well, who was Benjamin Franklin? We'll be hearing an excellent lecture also on Philadelphia as an intellectual center and a business hub. So I needn't mention or describe in depth Franklin's achievements as a founder of the Library Company, College of Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society, his service as colonial postmaster general, and his career as a publisher. But suffice to say that he migrated to Philadelphia in 1723, settled here permanently in 1726, and witnessed the most frenetic growth of any city in the colonies. Philadelphia reached 13,000 people by 1740. It surpassed Boston to reach 20,000 by 1760, and nearly 40,000 by 1776. Well, to be sure, that's only half the size of present-day Camden, New Jersey. But at the time, it made Philadelphia the largest English-speaking city on earth, except for London. The city was tightly packed. It reached inland only as far as 8th Street. We're on 12th Street here because it was much cheaper for people to subdivide their urban lots and to build up rather than out. Nevertheless, there were some 22 foreign visitors in this period who wrote mostly glowing travelogues about colonial Philadelphia. Lord Adam Gordon can speak for all. Quote, "Perhaps it's one of the wonders of the world if you consider its size, the number of inhabitants, the regularity of its streets, their spacious public and private buildings, quays and docks. One will not hesitate to call it the first town in America, but one that bids fair to rival almost any in Europe." Unquote. Not surprisingly, the diversity, freedom, and close quarters made for contentious politics among the pro-proprietary and anti-proprietary parties, among the Quakers, the Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Germans. Franklin was opposed to the proprietorship, but otherwise he was a party of one. He damned the stiff-rumped Quakers. He feared the swarming Germans, and he had little use for the others. But Franklin was careful to make close friends in every camp and devoted himself to the cause of unity. Unity within Pennsylvania, unity between Pennsylvania and the other colonies, unity between all the colonies and Great Britain. Though a great exponent of Enlightenment reason, Franklin even befriended the charismatic preacher George Whitefield, who made 8 visits to Philadelphia during the religious revival historians call the Great Awakening. Its enthusiastic, evangelical, individualistic faith split every denomination in two and severed the ties between American Protestants and their European mother churches, thus helping to lay the foundation for the revolutionary alliance between the awakened and the enlightened. Indeed, Philadelphians combined materialism with an idealism that never characterized New York, a toleration that never characterized New England, and an egalitarianism that never characterized Virginia. Moreover, the ability of Philadelphians to broadcast a diversity opinion was as fecund as their freedom to do so because of the tremendous printing industry. William Bradford's first printing press dated from 1686, just 3 years after Philadelphia was founded. Oh, Boston likes to brag, but it had to wait 18 years for its first printing press. Between 1740 and 1776, no less than 42 printers plied their trade in this city. Moreover, most of the city's elite came from somewhere else. 30% from other colonies and 25% from Europe. And since the Quakers discouraged higher education among their own people, the College of Philadelphia, or future University of Pennsylvania, founded by Whitefield and Franklin, drew only 5% of its students between 1757 and 1800 from wealthy locals. It was the first national university in that sense. Indeed, the WASP elite that we associate with Philadelphia really dates from the post-Civil War Industrial Revolution. The colonial city lacked what sociologists call a hegemonic or homogeneous elite. Such an elite did prevail in the southern plantation colonies, in the Hudson Valley, and up in Boston, where just 4% of the wealthy people were born abroad. Philadelphia, unlike any other part of the colonies, was truly cosmopolitan. Finally, Philadelphia was well supplied with boarding houses, taverns, and public buildings, especially the lavish State House, designed by Andrew Hamilton, where a sizable convention could meet in relative comfort. If there ever was any place where the colony's disparate delegates might contrive to make 13 clocks strike as one, in John Adams' words, it was Philadelphia. Except that Adams and other zealots from New England or Virginia still associated Philadelphia with Quaker passivity. So they came to the First Continental Congress in 1774 determined not to let the venue decide the outcome. It seemed Adams had a point. Even after 9 years of ferment, culminating in the occupation of Boston, years during which John Dickinson of Philadelphia became an American champion with his eloquent letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, Penn's colony remained notoriously conservative. But patriots, turned out, were mistaken to think that Philadelphia's culture was a barrier to bold action. First, I believe it was essential that Pennsylvania serve as a kind of anchor on the American ship of state, so that when at last it did sail forth, everyone except die-hard Tories were satisfied that the colonies had patiently gone the extra mile. That is, if even Philadelphia acquiesced in a Declaration of Independence, why then a critical mass of Americans could be counted on everywhere. Second, it turned out Adams was wrong about the temper of Philadelphia as a whole. It turned out the very hostility to authority and tradition, the very openness to new people and new ideas so characteristic of Penn's colony, created a space for the popular faction to take revolutionary action despite the opposition of stiff-rumped Quakers in the Assembly. The first inkling of that came in 1774, when the Boston Committee of Correspondence, desperate for support against the intolerable acts, sent Paul Revere on his first famous ride down to Philadelphia to beg Philadelphia merchants to join an embargo of British trade. Revere was welcomed by a mass rally at the City Tavern that attracted merchants, but scores of artisans and mechanics as well. And they persuaded John Dickinson to draft an invitation to, quote, a general Congress of deputies from the different colonies, clearly to state what we conceive our rights and to make claim or petition of them to His Majesty in firm but decent and dutiful terms, unquote. The proprietor, John Penn, forbade the assembly to participate, whereupon the popular party in Philadelphia staged an extra-legal convention and elected delegates anyway. When the Congress convened in September, John Adams, fearing the conservative reputation of Philadelphia, also prevailed on the First Continental Congress to spurn the State House with its Quaker Assembly connotations in favor of Carpenter's Hall, thinking that the working class influence would be, the artisan class influence would be more radical. Well, the First Continental Congress, what did it mean? Well, in 1765, there had been a Stamp Act Congress up in New York, and that befit the words 18th century sense of a gathering of representatives from separate political entities to concert their action for a specific purpose. Stamp Act Congress was, in that sense, a Congress. The Philadelphia body wasn't really a Congress at all, inasmuch as it gradually assumed the powers of an ad hoc legislature. And indeed, this First Continental Congress, by denying Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies, by rejecting the Galloway Plan, and by urging the colonies to prepare armed resistance, implied that its ultimate raison d'etre was self-government. The authors of a classic 1884 history of the city were not exaggerating when they claimed the following: to write a complete history of Philadelphia during the War of American Independence would, in effect, be to write the history of that revolution, from the beginning until the adoption of the Constitution. Philadelphia was the fulcrum which turned a long lever, unquote. My contemporary colleague, Michael Zuckerman, adds that geography is only opportunity, not destiny, and that the most intriguing issues involve the conditions of creativity, political creativity, economic, and especially cultural creativity in the 18th century city, unquote. Well, Philadelphia offered not only the locus and the atmosphere, but also a critical mass of leaders, including Franklin, Robert Morris, Charles Thompson, John Morton, James Wilson, and John Dickinson, many of whom were not native Philadelphians. How many people have heard of Charles Thompson, the eminence grise of the American Revolution? I sort of knew it. I knew the name, but I didn't really know very much about the guy until researching this lecture. Born in Northern Ireland, he arrived in America an 11-year-old orphan in 1740. He was seen to be condemned for life to be an apprentice to a blacksmith, but the plucky young lad ran away and then finally got lucky. Charitable benefactors had him schooled in Maryland and then in Philadelphia, where he went into business, got modestly rich, and married into the family that owned the Harriton Plantation in Lower Marion Township, 2 blocks away from my house. His first public service in 1757 was as shorthand recorder for the Quaker Council with the famous Indian Sachem Tidiuskung. Thompson took notes of the negotiation with the Indians, and indeed Tidiuskung gave Thompson a lifelong nickname, the Lenape word for truth-teller. During the crisis with Britain, John Adams gave him another nickname, the Sam Adams of Philadelphia. Well, in 1765, Thompson served as secretary to the Stamp Act Congress, and then, beginning in 1774, confidential secretary to the Continental Congress, in which post Thompson quietly stage-managed American politics for the next 14 years. He corresponded with Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, and every member of Congress. He knew all their jealousies and ambitions, where all the bodies were buried. He had personal charge of intelligence operations and ran networks of spies at home and abroad. Yet Thompson somehow made no personal enemies at all because he was humble, devout, patriotic, and utterly scrupulous. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775, by which time fighting had broken out up in Massachusetts. But there was no assurance that the 13 colonies would let those hot-headed Minutemen commit them to treason and war. The real sea change occurred in Philadelphia, where the formation of extra-legal committees to bypass the proprietors' assembly quickly became a habit. As one historian put it, Pennsylvania in spring 1774 was still governed by an oligarchy based on a restricted electorate. But in just 2 years, it turned into the most vibrant participatory democracy in the world. This radical militant populism became the basis for historian Carl Becker's claim that the American Revolution was not about home rule, but really about who would rule at home, a claim that obviously has been revived by the Marxist historian Gary Nash. But the important point for our story is that the Patriot faction in Congress was greatly encouraged by what was happening in Philadelphia's streets. The populist movement climaxed in the formation of militia committees that made the willingness to bear arms the measure of patriotism, in defiance, of course, of the Quakers. Thousands of militiamen marched, drilled, and in effect governed in defiance of the proprietor and the assembly, until the populace and the Congress that was meeting in its midst were psychologically prepared for revolution. Pennsylvanians ceased taking counsel of their own fears and instead, like other colonists, took up arms in the belief that a just God would favor their cause. Accordingly, the Second Continental Congress began to function as an American government, even before independence. On June 14th, 1775, it founded the Continental Army and named Washington its commander. Of course, Adams was the wise head who nominated the gentleman from Virginia in order to cement the alliance between New England and the South. But it's hard to imagine his unanimous selection if Congress had met anywhere but on Philadelphia's neutral ground. October 13, 1775 was the birthday of the United States Navy, and November 10th of the Marine Corps. Still, opinions were sharply divided over independence, which Pennsylvania delegates Dickinson, his legal protege James Wilson, and businessman Robert Morris considered risky and premature. It was to appease them that Congress sent a final olive branch petition to the king, even as it also approved a plan to invade Canada. Then, in November of 1775, yet another sojourner arrived in Philadelphia, having sailed over from England on the advice of Benjamin Franklin. In just a few weeks, Tom Paine captured the mood of the city in Common Sense. And in just a few months, thanks to Philadelphia's printers and Franklin's post office, Paine's pamphlet had evangelized all the colonies with the Republican gospel. That emboldened Virginia Congressman Richard Henry Lee to call the question on June 3rd, 1776. The King's Hessian treaties, he cried, leave no doubt but that our enemies are determined upon the absolute conquest and subduction of North America. It is not choice, but necessity that calls for independence as the only means by which foreign alliances can be obtained, and a proper confederation by which internal peace and union can be secured." Unquote. Well, 11 days after that resolution was introduced in Congress, those extra-legal militias in Philadelphia goaded the Pennsylvania Assembly into resolving in favor of, quote, "forming further compacts between the United Colonies, concluding such treaties with foreign kingdoms and states, and in adopting such other measures as shall be judged necessary for promoting the liberty, safety, and interests of America," unquote. Well, Lee's motion was hotly debated until July 1st when it came to a vote. 9 colonies voted aye. New York's delegation, pleading no instructions, abstained. Delaware divided 1-1 because Patriot Caesar Rodney was absent. And South Carolina and Pennsylvania split narrowly against. The tension was electric. The British were on the verge of invading New York. Hundreds of sails had already been sighted off Long Island. Was this the best time to declare independence, or the worst? If Pennsylvania continued to hang back, chances were Delaware, New Jersey, and New York would too, and the national edifice would collapse for want of its keystone. Then something happened, which historians to this day cannot fully explain. When a second vote for independence came up on July 2nd, Morris and Dickinson retreated behind the bar, sat with the gallery, and recused themselves. That left Pennsylvania's decision up to Franklin and Morton, who were in favor, Willing and Humphreys, who were opposed, and James Wilson, who reluctantly broke with his mentor Dickinson and cast the decisive vote for independence. He did so, he said, because the people of Philadelphia have made their will clear in the, quote, recent dramatic events, unquote. Why did the others recuse themselves? Well, Morris explained that while he still hoped for negotiations, he knew that the colony's main leverage in negotiations was their unity, and he didn't dare stand in the way of that. He later signed the Declaration of Independence. Dickinson never did, even though he knew it would turn his popularity into calumny. "I have so much of the spirit of martyrdom in me that I've been conscientiously compelled to endure in my political capacity the fires and faggots of persecution, unquote. Pompous man. But he recused himself. He didn't stand in the way. Well, New York still abstained, but when Delaware and South Carolina fell into line, Congress pronounced the Declaration of Independence to be unanimous on July 2nd. On July 3rd, Philadelphia's Militia Committee chose its own slate of revolutionaries for Pennsylvania's Constitutional Convention. And on July 4th, Congress approved Jefferson's redacted draft. And then on July 8th, the Philadelphia crowds tore the royal coat of arms from the State House facade. Historians Carl and Jessica Breidenbaugh summed up the unique metamorphosis. Between 1760 and 75, Philadelphia came of age and was now spiritually prepared to go its own way alone. Silently and for the most part unconsciously, it had undergone an intellectual revolution. This process, effected by hundreds of eager, able, intelligent Philadelphians, produced on the banks of the Delaware the first broadly democratic society of modern times, unquote. That's the Declaration. How about the war? To suggest the Philadelphia factor was equally indispensable to the outcome of the War of Independence would be a stretch. Even British occupation of the city in 1777-78, during which Washington's army was out at Valley Forge, had no strategic impact at all. But two Philadelphians, Franklin and Morris, played indispensable roles as the chief diplomat and chief financier of the American cause. Now, David Hackett Fisher, in his brilliant encyclopedic history, Albion's Seed, described the four cradle cultures that British colonists planted in North America: the Puritans of New England, the Quakers of the Delaware Valley, the Cavaliers of the Chesapeake, and the Scots-Irish bordermen on the frontier. Fisher also imagined the War of Independence as a sequence of conflicts fought in serial fashion by the four cultures. Phase one was the Puritans' War, a popular uprising egged on by their congregational clergy. Phase two was the Cavaliers' War, in which regular armies led by gentlemen fought conventional battles. Phase three was the Bordermen's War, waged mostly by partisans in the southern backcountry. Think of Francis the Swamp Fox Marion. Phase four was, if not the Quakers' War, then a political war led by civilians from the middle colonies. Well, in fact, all four phases occurred simultaneously, and success depended on all of them. Not least, however, the Civilians' War. Indeed, the most decisive event was that revealed to Washington's army on March 29, 1778, when a courier rode into Valley Forge with astounding news. King Louis XVI has received Dr. Franklin at the French court and concluded a full military alliance with the United States. Now, the main purpose of the Declaration of Independence, you'll remember from those quotes that I gave you, was to enable Congress to solicit foreign aid, to deal with foreign governments, to help it in its struggle against the British. As early as November 1775, the Congress appointed a secret committee of correspondence, which in turn sent Silas Deane over to spy out prospects in Europe. Then, after the 4th of July, the committee begged the 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin to head America's delegation. Now, Franklin had lived in Europe over 20-odd years and was well known in Paris as a scientist, statesman, philosopher, and witty colonial rustic, roles that he now reprised to perfection. Franklin's experience taught him that to be forthright, direct, and impatient in Europe's Machiavellian politics was the sure way to fail, whereas deviousness, indirection, and patience at least offered a chance of success. Congress knew nothing of that when it asked John Adams to draft a so-called model treaty in 1776, a simple pact of friendship and commerce that it expected was enough to win recognition from all foreign countries. Franklin didn't even waste the time of French Foreign Minister Vergennes with such displays of American idealism, or for that matter, Puritan moralism. Instead, Franklin engaged in duplicitous correspondence to throw off the ubiquitous British spies. He assisted Silas Deane's clandestine shipments of French arms and money, and otherwise bided his time. He knew that diplomacy couldn't make a breakthrough until some big American victory gave Vergennes the argument he needed to persuade the king that the American cause was for real. And the Battle of Saratoga did the trick. On February 6, 1778, Franklin concluded a military alliance with Bourbon, France, later joined by Bourbon, Spain, and all parties made solemn pledges to make war and peace together. How critical was the alliance to American independence? Suffice to say that Washington won the climactic 1781 Battle of Yorktown, courtesy of a French army under the Count de Rochambeau, a Franco-American army under the Marquis de Lafayette, a French fleet under Admiral François de Grasse, and a campaign drafted by the Spanish commander in Cuba, Francisco Savreda de Sangronis. Amazing. Sangronis had originally come up with a plan to send de Grasse's fleet up north and bottle up the British in Yorktown if only they could persuade Washington to march his army south. Of course, the French crown did not wage war for a revolutionary republic out of ideological affinity, but rather to avenge their prior defeat, disrupt the British Empire, and perhaps regain some colonies. Moreover, the French showed signs of wanting to make the United States a kind of a client, and indeed to restrict its own territorial growth. That is why, when the British offered negotiations after Yorktown, Franklin double-crossed Vergennes. His fellow commissioners John Jay and John Adams were alternately shocked or confused by Franklin's maneuvers as he played Britain and France off against each other. But they were happy to share the credit for the generous terms of independence that Franklin obtained in the Peace of Paris of 1783. Adams even boasted in retrospect, "We were better diplomats than we imagined," unquote. Right. Congress was pleased to ratify the treaty unanimously, and nobody inquired too closely into the tactics whereby it was achieved. Now, what most textbooks do not tell you is that arms alone don't win wars, and wars rarely pay for themselves. In 1781, the apparent year of victory, the American war chest was empty and Congress $25 million in debt. That was when Philadelphian Robert Morris he'd done it before, placed his personal fortune at the disposal of the new nation. Congress, in turn, broke with its precedent by creating not a committee, but an executive office for Morris, Superintendent of Finance, a post which he held until 1784. No one personified better that American gift for creative corruption, that is, for public-spirited hustling. Morris would be accused of seeking dictatorial powers, lining his own pockets, misleading investors, or at least indulging the reckless greed that later would confine him to debtor's prison in 1798. But Morris also deserves the sobriquet financier of the Revolution. Born in Liverpool, where he lived until age 13, Morris's father became a tobacco factor in Maryland. He apprenticed his promising lad to Thomas Willing's merchant house in Philadelphia. Well, by 1754, when Morris was only 20, he'd become a partner, and he went on to make fortunes in just about every enterprise available to an American shipper and merchant, including outfitting privateers, engaging in the slave trade, in the opium trade, and in legitimate commerce with the West Indies, Mediterranean, and India. In 1776, Morris doubted the wisdom of declaring independence as I said, but once it was done, he threw himself into the cause. I am not one of those politicians that run testy when my own plans are not adopted. I think it is the duty of a good citizen to follow when he cannot lead." Unquote. In 1776 and 77, Morris exhorted Philadelphia businessmen to purchase supplies for Washington's troops on their own, and he issued Morris notes backed by his own money. He served in the new state assembly, where he worked to establish checks and balances and to overturn religious tests for office, which the revolutionary Presbyterians had used to exclude Quakers, Mennonites, and Jews. Morris also assisted James Wilson in his defense of patriotic war financier Haym Salomon against charges of profiteering. In 1781, Congress granted its superintendent of finance specific permission to continue his private investments while in office, which made the latter accusations of conflicts of interest ring hollow. Indeed, one of his first official acts was to help underwrite the Yorktown campaign. But that victory turned a war of bullets into a war of bottom lines, because the British still had reason to hope that the United States would perish from bankruptcy, its success on the battlefield notwithstanding. Thanks to the Bank of North America, however, founded by Morris in December 1781, Congress and the Continental Army staggered to the finish line. General Washington did not forget. Indeed, he remained a close friend of Robert Morris and also his house guest during the months May to September 1787. Oh my, those were the months of the Constitutional Convention. That's right. And here's, you might say, chapter 3 in the story. The Constitutional Convention, which worked what author Catherine Drinker Brown called a miracle at Philadelphia. But this time, the venue was not a sure thing. In June of 1783, 2 months after that Newburgh conspiracy, where officers in the Continental Army had threatened to march on Congress demanding pay and pensions, in June of 1783, some Pennsylvania soldiers did march on Congress, sitting here in Philadelphia, hoping to extract money and pensions. The Congress, after 9 years in the city, now damned the unhealthy and dangerous atmosphere created by Philadelphia's mob rule and removed itself first to Princeton, then to New York. Philadelphians, after 9 years, bade good riddance to Congress, which, noted Benjamin Rush, was abused, laughed at, pitied, and cursed in every company. Well, after the war, the Congress of the Articles of Confederation really did just wither away. The new nation desperately needed an executive branch to oversee commerce, defense, and foreign affairs. That is why the ad hoc Annapolis Convention of 1786, which meant to coordinate trade and navigation on the Potomac, recommended that all 13 states send delegates to a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Did it matter that their choice was Philadelphia? I put that question to my colleague Richard Beeman, author of a recent book on the convention, and he replied as follows: I believe that with the rule of secrecy being so faithfully observed by the delegates, they could have been meeting in a barn in western Georgia, and the outcome might well have been the same. On the other hand, if the convention were held in western Georgia, it probably would have only attracted a handful of delegates, unquote. Exactly so. But one can't help think that it mattered a great deal the convention was held in Philadelphia, where independence had been declared and the new nation forged. The only obvious alternative was New York, but the organizers saw the wisdom in not meeting under the jealous eyes of the Congress, which was now seated in New York. What is more, all of the features that favored Philadelphia in 1776 applied even more in 1787. Philadelphia's population was 60% larger than New York's, just as cosmopolitan. Its docks were loaded with goods from all over the world, thanks in part to Robert Morris, who had just opened up the China trade. Its reputation for enlightenment was enhanced by all those institutions, but a new institution as well, the Repository for Natural Curiosities, otherwise known as Peale's Museum. Charles Wilson Peale, another native of Maryland, was attracted to Philadelphia at age 25 because of its revolutionary politics. He won national fame as an artist, scientist, inventor, and entrepreneur. All the delegates visited Peale's Museum of Natural History, which a gushing Frenchman described as the temple of God. Here is nothing but truth and reason. Well, historians debate how much credit atmospherics deserve for inspiring the plain, honest men of the Constitutional Convention. They roomed, drank, and dined together at the City Tavern, Indian Queen, and London Coffee House. They suffered together the stench of the butchers and tanners, the open sewage, pestiferous flies, and oppressive heat. They marveled together in gardens graced with hummingbirds by day and fireflies by night. Perhaps all of that helps to explain how 39, at least, of the 55 delegates crafted a document that secured this nation its future. What isn't a matter of historical debate is the quality of the Pennsylvania delegation itself. James Wilson, my own favorite founder, was a brilliant Scotsman who emigrated to Philadelphia at age 24 and quickly built a successful law practice. He represented Pennsylvania in both Continental Congresses and, as you know, cast a decisive vote for independence. Wilson also ran afoul of a drunken mob in 1778 because he bravely defended wealthy residents who were suspected of collaborating with the British occupation. The firebrands laid siege to his house until the first city troop rode to the rescue. In the 1790s, Wilson would become the University of Pennsylvania's first professor of law and one of the first Supreme Court justices appointed by President Washington. But Wilson's most lasting contributions were at the Constitutional Convention, where he consistently argued for, quote, a republic or democracy where the people at large retain the supreme power and act either collectively or by representation, unquote. Wilson also proposed the 3/5 compromise on congressional representation in the slaveholding states. He advocated popular election of the House and the Senate, didn't get his way there, and argued strenuously on behalf of a single executive. And then he did more than anyone to define the office of president. Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris nominated Washington to chair the convention, and then he worked behind the scenes to ensure that the clauses on taxation and commerce were flexible and confined to essential principles only. He also recommended that Pennsylvanians choose Gouverneur Morris, the elegant wordsmith responsible for the style and brevity of the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, now 81, performed his final service as a member of the ad hoc committee appointed to break the deadlock between large and small states. Franklin's endorsement of the so-called Connecticut Plan for equal representation in the Senate and proportional in the House proved decisive. And that was because a crucial swing vote in favor was cast by North Carolina, which had previously voted with the large states. Why did the Tar Heels change their mind? Because their most eloquent delegate was a Franklin protege, Dr. Hugh Williamson, a native of Chester, Pennsylvania, and a graduate of the College of Philadelphia. He'd gone to North Carolina during the war, and he'd served as a military doctor and was revered as a patriot and a Federalist. Finally, no one understood better than James Wilson how vital it was to get the Constitution ratified quickly and without amendment. So prior to adjournment, he proposed rules whereby states would vote in special conventions and only 9 ratifications required for the Constitution to go into effect. He left nothing to chance. The day after the signing of the Constitution, he got Federalists in the Pennsylvania Assembly to resolve that there would be such a convention in just 2 months. Wilson then directed an exhaustive campaign of public publicity in newspapers and speeches, and he was rewarded when the Constitution was ratified by Pennsylvania, 46-23. Delaware had done so 6 days earlier, which is why it claims to be the first state. But Pennsylvania created the big state momentum that would go on to carry Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. Once again, the United States of America were a product of Philadelphia. Remember Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, spy master, eminence grise? Evidently, he corresponded with Washington about writing their memoirs, since nobody knew better than those two what had really happened. Washington dismissed the idea. No, he did not wish to lie to the American people, nor did he wish to disillusion them with the truth. So he suggested they just humbly give all the credit to Providence. Thompson must have agreed, because he burned all his secret archives before his death. Does Philadelphia own the 4th of July? It sure did on July the 4th, 1788, when the city staged its first great bash to celebrate ratification of the Constitution by the 9th state, New Hampshire. The festivities began at sunrise when church bells rang out and the Liberty Bell pealed in reply. Gunships on the river fired salutes, and 5,000 people, representing all the arts and sciences and trades, Masonic lodges, the resplendent First City Troop, all gathered to march in a parade that stretched 1.5 miles by the time it reached the country estate of Bush Hill, now located at about 17th and Spring Garden, but in those days way out in the country. The pièce de résistance of the celebration was the grand federal edifice, a kind of a float in the shape of a Corinthian columned temple, a kind of an allegory of the Constitution designed by Charles Wilson Peel. Who gave the great victory speech? James Wilson, after which the crowd repaired to a gigantic circle of tables loaded down with refreshments. There, Francis Hopkinson, the master of ceremonies, and incidentally the designer of the American flag, decreed there would be no imported wines or spirits served at the party, only good American porter, beer, and hard cider. Francis Hopkinson was another Philadelphia polymath, renowned as a statesman, lawyer, businessman, artist, musical composer, inventor, and poet. Poet, for instance, of the ode written for this 4th of July. Oh, for a muse of fire to mount the skies, and to a listening world proclaim, behold, behold, an empire rise. An era new, time as he flies, hath entered in the book of fame. My sons for freedom fought, nor fought in vain, but a naked goddess was their gain. Good government alone can show the maid in robes of social happiness arrayed. Hail to the festival, all hail the day, Columbia's standard on her roof display. And let the people's motto ever be, united thus, and thus united free. Thank you very much.